My name is Monet, and I am your host of Winding Through Time, the podcast that travels through time to explore different people, places, and events while pairing these facts with wine. To learn how a U.S. president went from being praised for saving thousands from hunger to being blamed for starving thousands during the Great Depression. Tune into this episode of Winding Through Time as I explore how Hoover put the who in hooch. Welcome back to Winding Through Time. I'm your host, Monet, and I am so glad that you decided to join me for my newest episode of Winding Through Time. This is an episode that I actually mentioned on my very first episode, Strange Fruit. So I'm extremely excited about finally being able to record this and share this information with you all this evening. So thank you again for joining me. So let's just go ahead and jump in to the episode. So, what do you think when you hear the name Hoover? Do you think of the Hoover Dam, Hoover Town, or even Whoville? If you thought of Herbert Hoover, the 31st president, you're spot on for this episode. So, when a lot of people think of President Hoover, they think of him presiding over the U.S. during one of the worst economic periods of all time, the Great Depression. Now, I'm not debating that because it's true, but I think it's very interesting how he went from hero to villain so fast. I mean, this man was literally celebrated as feeding hundreds and thousands and millions of people during one war. And a little over a decade later, he would be blamed for starving hundreds and thousands, millions of people. There's so much irony in Hoover's past and what would occur during his presidency, from his views of government in regards to the economy and words spoken during his campaign. Um, and to understand how this happened and how this influenced him, let's take a closer look at President Hoover's life. He was born in 1874 to a Quaker family in West Bank, Iowa. Both of his parents unfortunately died by the time he was 10, and he would be raised by a family in Oregon. He enrolled in Stanford's inaugural class of 1891, and he would go on to earn a degree in geology. Um, he married his college sweetheart, and they moved to China, where he would work for a private corporation as an engineer. And he was an exceptional engineer, and his decades long career would actually lead to him becoming a multimillionaire. And it would provide him with an opportunity to gauge in more philanthropic opportunities. At the onset of World War One, he actually led efforts to safely return over 100,000 American tourists stranded in Europe. And the government was so impressed with his skills that he was recruited by President Woodrow Wilson to lead the U.S. Food Administration. Now, while in this position, Hoover coordinated operations that delivered food to more than 20 war torn countries. These efforts fed millions of people, and he was responsible for the diversion of aid to the Soviet Union between 1921 and 1923. And this effort fed millions daily. He was so gracious that his efforts were mistaken as support for communism. Now, Hoover's reply to that was, whatever their politics shall be, they shall be fed. So he would later go on to serve in President Warren Harding's administration as Secretary of Commerce. And he was viewed as progressive and believed that the government should play a small role and only support the growth of businesses. Under President Coolidge, Hoover would continue to serve as Secretary of Commerce, and he led the efforts that would lead to the construction of the Hoover Dam. You don't say, right? So after World War One, he was just so respected for his humanitarian work that both the Democrats and the Republicans wanted him as their presidential candidate. He would finally get his shot at the presidency when Coolidge decided not to run for another term, and he convincingly won the presidential race in 1928. During his campaign, Hoover said, "We are nearer today to the ideal of the abolition of poverty and fear from the lives of men and women than ever before in any land." So, when Hoover entered the office, the U.S. was experiencing prosperity at great levels. And this can be contributed to a few things. One was the technological advances in mass production. In addition to mass production, you also have the expansion of credit. So when you combine mass production and easier access to credit, you have an increase in consumer purchases. I mean, now you have the average Americans purchasing automobiles, vacuums, and radios, which items they were once reserved are viewed as only the wealthy owning them. Adding to this economic prosperity was also the stock market. And the stock market was soaring to new levels due to low interest rates on stocks. I mean, you even had some investors who purchased stocks on credit, and this caused the prices to increase even more. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like a recipe for disaster, you are absolutely right. In fact, a year later, the stock market would crash and it would start the Great Depression. So this crash actually happened in October 1929, and that day will be later referred to as Black Thursday. And this is when the market crashed and millions of investors were wiped out at the blink of an eye. Now, it's important for us to realize that not only investors and millionaires were affected by this, but a lot of average Americans purchased stocks, so they were also affected, which a lot of people don't think of during this time as the average American owning stock. Well, at least for me, when I thought the Great Depression and the stock market crashing, you hear about all of these investors and some of them jumping off buildings. I didn't think of the average person. I just thought of the incredibly wealthy and rich. But some everyday Americans, they purchased this stock and they purchased it actually at record levels. They would purchase it on installment plans and some via investment clubs. So when the market crashed, making these stocks worthless, that pain was felt by many, not just the super wealthy and those investors. Now, contrary to what some might believe, Hoover did not have a let them eat cake attitude when the crash occurred. He actually made several attempts to try and save the economy. And some of his initial strategies included convincing private industries to maintain wages. He tried to speed up public works and construction projects. And he also secured over $150 million in tax cuts. He was initially commended for these moves, um, but unfortunately, it did not change the spending habits of Americans, and they continued to cut back. And this reduction in spending led to a decrease in production and ultimately a decrease in the workforce. Hoover would continue to work on this problem by implementing the President's Emergency Committee for Employment, which attempted to increase employment in the private sector. And he also worked with Congress, the Federal Reserve, Federal Farm Board, and also the Red Cross. These programs, they would have limited success, but bank collapses in Europe would doom any possible chances of any success for him. Hoover, he was still working hard and he would try to create more plans and programs, but their success was very limited. And the American people, they were just fed up at this point. Hoover began to be met with criticism for almost every program that he put forth. And a lot of Americans viewed him as wasteful, out of touch, and pessimistic. So when the election of 1932 rolled around and an optimistic, charismatic governor from New York threw his hat into the ring, Americans were more than happy to support him. And in 1932, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected as the 32nd president of the United States. Now, also contrary to what some might believe, the Depression did not end with Roosevelt's election, but legislation, and this is something I found interesting. Sometimes this was almost identical to what was proposed by President Hoover. This legislation was passed at lightning speed, and slight improvements in the economy began to show, but the Depression would still linger on for 7 more years until World War II. Now, you can imagine that some people wanted to drown their sorrows in a nice glass of wine, but a lack of money and also prohibition made this difficult. It made it almost impossible to get a drink. So during this time, poor weather, the depression, and the earthquake and prohibition again affected the wine industry greatly. So the quality and the taste of the wine being produced was also greatly affected by this. The wine industry suffered greatly, and some of the vineyards survived by making wines for rabbis and priests. And this caused many people to resort to making homemade wines to satisfy that urge. And these homemade drinks would be referred to as hooch. So households were allowed to legally produce 200 gallons of personal wine. So you can imagine a lot of people took advantage of this opportunity. And some in the prison system are still taking advantage of this, unfortunately. Now there are many different recipes for hooch. And outside of your basic equipment that you'll need, depending on what you have access to, some people use Ziploc bags, some people use jugs. So outside of that equipment, I'll let you research and see what best suit you're suited for. You're going to need some fruit or a fruit juice base, sugar, and yeast. So for the sake of time, I won't outline the steps that I took to make my hooch, but I will tell you that I used apples and grapes for this experiment. And that is exactly what this was. This was an experiment for me. So, oh, where can we start? The appearance. So it looked like, I want to say, cloudy juice. Like if I set out some juice for a while and it just, it was a cloudy appearance. There was sustenance at the bottom. And I honestly was a little nervous to try because I saw remnants, and it was probably from the yeast or something or the sugar around the tops. But I said, no, I've been talking about this for a while. I'm going to be brave. I'm going to try it. So it was really cloudy, a very cloudy appearance in the container. Once I poured it, it was more clear, and it is a very pungent smell. It smells like just straight alcohol. That is what hit me. There were no notes there, just alcohol. It was a very pungent smell of alcohol. So I was brave and I did try it, and I did taste the fruit, but it it burned. I don't know if I did it right, and I am just I will open myself up to suggestions on if like I have some homemade hooch makers who are listening that do this and they do it well. But that is the first thing I tasted. It was alcohol, like burning going down. I did taste some of the fruit, so it was a little sweet, but the alcohol was just very overpowering. Um, and that's all I tasted. As a matter of fact, I felt like I had heartburn hours later from this taste. So I can't even imagine. I mean, I can imagine that it would definitely help you to drown your sorrows because I imagine that the alcohol content was very high, but that's all I tasted really. It's just a very prominent taste of alcohol. Um, and a little sweetness that followed, but the smell and the taste is just pure like, okay, this is a nice punch to it. I'm not really sure if I did it right because I looked at some videos and I did some more research on people who make hooch, and I saw one individual. His looked very similar to mine, um, but yes, it was very interesting. It's definitely not something that I could drink a more than a swallow of because the taste of alcohol just hit me, and so much so to the fact that I took maybe 2 sips, and a few hours later I still feel it in my chest. So I can imagine if I had lost everything or I was just down on my luck, this might be something that I might have had to get me over the hump. But thank goodness that I have access to great wine or wine that's produced by professionals. But please too. Go on my social media accounts or send me an email or respond here and let me know if you are a hooch maker. Is this what it's like? Is this what it's supposed to be? Because I would not do this again, but I'm open to it if I get some really good suggestions on how to do it properly. Definitely, please let me know. I'm definitely open to it. So again, Thank you so much for hanging in there with me and finally learning how Hoover put the who in hooch. If you're out there and you're a hooch maker and you have some advice for me, I'm willing to give it another shot to see if I can get it right. But thank you for tuning in with me this evening. Tune in for the next episode. It's going to be a surprise. I have a couple of things brewing, so join me next Wednesday for my surprise episode of Winding Through Time. I will definitely be dropping hints on my social media account. So if you don't already follow me, go ahead and look me up on Twitter. I'm Winding Through Time on Facebook and Instagram as well. I look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Have a good one, and thanks again for joining me.